Before you look at the balcony, the swimming pool, or the ocean view, there are 5 documents that can save you from making a very expensive mistake. Because when you buy a property in the Canary Islands, the real risk is not always what you see in the photos. The risk may be hidden in the land registry, in an unpaid mortgage, in a community debts, in urban planning issues, or in a deposit contract signed too quickly. So, if you are planning to buy a house, an apartment, or an investment property in the Canary Islands, this video is for you. Today, I will explain the taxes, the cost, the documents, and the most common mistake you should know before signing anything. Because buying property is not only about finding the right place, it is about buying safely. The first thing you need to understand is the difference between buying a new property and buying a resale property, because the taxes are not the same. And this is one of the first mistakes many buyers make when they start calculating the real cost of the purchase. If you buy a new property directly from a developer, the transaction is usually subject to EGIC, which is the Canary Island indirect tax. And in many cases, you may also have to consider stamp duty or documented legal acts. But if you buy a resale property from a private seller, the transaction is usually subject to transfer tax. And this difference is very important because it affects your budget from the very beginning. Many people look only at the sale price. They see the price on the real estate website, they calculate the mortgage, they calculate the deposit, but they forget that the final cost of buying a property is always higher than the price of the property itself. You have to consider taxes, notary fees, land registry fees, possible agency fees, bank cost, valuation cost if there is a mortgage, and sometimes translation or legal assistance cost, especially for foreign buyers. So, before you make an offer, before you sign a reservation, and definitely before you sign a deposit contract, you need to know whether you are buying a new property or a resale property, because this will determine the tax treatment of the transaction, and it will also help you understand how much money you really need to complete the purchase safely. And once you know whether you are buying a new property or a resale property, the next question is very simple. How much will this purchase really cost you? Because the price you see in the real estate advert is not the final cost of the operation. If you buy a resale property in the Canary Islands, you will normally have to consider transfer tax. And as a general reference, the standard rate for real estate transfers in the Canary Islands is currently 6.5%. But this does not mean that every buyer will always pay exactly the same, because there may be reduced taxes depending on the buyer, the type of property, whether it will be the main residency, and other legal requirements. If you buy a new property from a developer, the transaction will normally be subject to EGIC instead to transfer tax. And you may also have to consider stamp duty, especially when the purchase is formalized in a public deed and the transaction meets the legal requirements for documented legal acts. But taxes are only one part of the budget. You also need to consider notary fees, land registry fees, possible agency fees, valuation costs if there is a mortgage, bank cost, translation cost, legal advice, and sometimes power of attorney costs if the buyer cannot come to Spain to sign personally. This is why I always recommend preparing a complete purchase budget before signing anything. Not only the price of the property, not only the deposit, but the full amount you will need to complete the purchase safely. Because one of the worst situations for a buyer is to discover too late that the property was affordable, but the total operation was not. And this brings us to another very important point, especially if you are a foreign buyer, because buying a property in the Canary Islands is not only about choosing the property and having the money available. You also need to be ready from an administrative and banking point of view. The first key element is the NIE, the foreign identification number in Spain. Without it, you will normally not be able to complete the purchase, pay taxes, or appear properly in the Spanish legal and tax system. So, if you are not Spanish and you are planning to buy a property, do not leave the NIE until the last minute, because a delay with the NIE can delay the whole transaction. The second point is the bank account. In many cases, having a Spanish bank account can make the process much easier, especially for payments, taxes, utilities, community fees, and the future property expenses. And the third point, which is becoming more and more important, is the source of funds. In other words, where the money comes from, because the bank, the notary, or the professionals involved in the transaction may ask you to justify the origin of the funds. This can include savings, salary, dividends, sale of another property, company income, inheritance, or other legitimate source. And this is not just a formality, it is part of the anti-money laundering controls that apply to real estate transactions. So, if you are buying from abroad, you should prepare this documentation before sending large amount of money or before signing a deposit contract, because having the money is not always enough. You must also be able to explain it, document it, and transfer it correctly. And this is why a safe purchase is not improvised at the last moment. It is prepared step by step before the signature. Before we continue, let me make a quick pause. If you are planning to buy a property in the Canary Islands and you want to avoid mistakes before signing a deposit contract, at Fiscal Tax Canarias or Comprare Casa alle Canarie, we can help you review the operation before the problem appears. We can check the taxes, the documentation, the purchase structure, the fiscal implication, and the main risk before you commit your money. This is especially important if you are buying from abroad, if you are not familiar with the Spanish system, or if you are buying for investment, rental income, or future relocation. Because the best moment to ask for advice is not when the problem is already on the table. It is before signing, before transferring money, and before accepting conditions that you may not fully understand. So, if you are thinking about buying a house, an apartment, a bungalow, or an investment property in the Canary Islands, contact Fiscal Tax Canarias or Comprare Casa alle Canarie, and we will help you review the operation with a clear tax and legal perspective. Now, let's continue with another key point for foreign buyers: the 5 documents you must review before signing. And once the buyer is ready from a financial, banking, and administrative point of view, we arrive at the most important part of the process, the documents, because before signing a deposit contract, before transferring money, and before committing yourself to the purchase, you need to know exactly what you are buying. And the first document should review is a land register extract, known in Spain as the Nota Simple. This document allows you to check who's the legal owner, whether the property has a mortgage, whether there are charge limitation risks, right of use, embarks, or any other register issue that could affect the purchase. And this is essential because the person selling the property must really have the right to sell it. And the property must be transferred with the legal condition that you expect. The second document is the community information, especially if you are buying an apartment, a bungalow, or a property inside a resident complex. You need to know if there are unpaid community fees, extraordinary payments, legal dispute, restriction, or community rules that may affect the use of the property. The third point is to review local taxes and utilities. For example, property tax, rubbish collection fees, water, electricity, and other regular expenses, because sometimes the problem is not only the purchase price. The problem is what the property will cost you every year after the purchase. The fourth point is the urban planning situation. And this is especially important in the Canary Islands because you may find properties with extension, closed terraces, converted garages, works that were never properly declared, or properties located in areas where the legal use must be reviewed carefully. And the fifth document is the deposit contract itself. The contract that many buyers sign too quickly because they are afraid of losing the property. But this contract is not just a simple reservation. It can define the price, the deadlines, the conditions, the consequences if one party does not complete the purchase. What happens if the mortgage is not approved? What furniture is included? Who pays each expense? And whether the property must be delivered free of charges, tenants or occupants. So, before signing anything, remember this. The problem is not signing a deposit contract. The problem is signing it before understanding the documents. Because once you sign a transfer money, negotiating becomes much more difficult. And after reviewing the documents, there is another question that every buyer should ask before completing the purchase. What is the real purpose of this property? Because buying a property to live in is not the same that buying a property to rent out. And buying a property as long-term investment is not the same as buying it for holiday rental or tourist use. If you are buying the property to live in, the main questions are usually different. You will want to know if the property can become your main residence, what taxes apply, whether you can accept any reduced tax rate, or how much the mortgage will cost, what the community fees are, and whether the property is legally and practically suitable for your daily life. But if you are buying to rent the property on a long-term basis, the analysis changes completely. Now, you need to calculate the real net profitability, not only the rent you expect to receive, but also taxes, community fees, repairs, insurance, maintenance, possible periods without tenants, and the tax treatment of the rental income. And if your idea is buy for holiday rental or tourist use, then you need to be even more careful, because not every beautiful apartment in the Canary Islands can automatically be used as a holiday rental. You must check the urban planning situation, the community rules, the tourist regulation, the permitted use of the property, and whether the activity is legally possible in that specific case. This is where many investors make mistakes. They calculate the income they would like to obtain, but they do not check whether the property can legally generate that income. And this is why the purpose of the purchase must be clear before signing, because the same property can be a good home, a bad rental investment, or a risky tourist project depending on the legal, tax, and urban planning situation. So, before buying it, do not only ask yourself if you like the property, ask yourself what you want to do with it, and whether the documents, the numbers, and the law support that plan. And this brings us to the final part of the video, the most common mistakes buyers make when purchasing property in the Canary Islands. And the first mistake is very simple: falling in love with the property before reviewing the documents. This happens all the time. The buyer sees the terrace, the swimming pool, the ocean view, the location, the potential rental income, and emotionally the decision is already made, but the documents have not been checked yet. And this is dangerous because a beautiful property can still have legal, tax, urban planning, or financial problems. The second mistake is signing a deposit contract too quickly. Many buyers sign because they are afraid of losing the property, but they do not fully understand what they are signing. What happens if the mortgage is not approved? What happens if the seller cannot cancel a charge? What happens if the property has urban planning issues? Or what happens if the buyer changes their mind? The third mistake is calculating only the purchase price and not the total cost of the operation, because taxes, notary, land registry, bank cost, valuation, legal advice, translation, and future expenses can change the real budget completely. The fourth mistake is assuming that every property can be rented or used for holiday rental. And this is especially risky for investors because the property may look perfect from tourists, but the community rules, urban planning situation, or applicable regulation may limit or even prevent that use. The fifth mistake is not preparing the NIE, the bank account, and the source of funds in advance, especially when the buyer is foreign and the money comes from another country. And the sixth mistake is trying to solve everything after signing, when the buyer has already transferred the money and has much less negotiating power. So the key message is this: do not wait until the problem is already on the table. Review the property before signing, review the documents before transferring money, and make sure that the legal, tax, and financial situation supports the purchase you want to make. And if you remember only one thing from this video, remember this: buying property in the Canary Islands is not only about finding a beautiful house, a good price, or a nice view. It is about understanding what you are buying before you commit your money. Because once the deposit contract is signed, once the money has been transferred, and once the deadlines have started running, solving problems becomes much more difficult. That is why the best moment to review the transaction is not after the problems appear. It is before signing the deposit contract, before accepting conditions that you may not fully understand, and before assuming that everything is fine just because the property looks perfect in the photos. So, if you are thinking about buying a house, an apartment, a bungalow, or an investment property in Canary Island, we can help you review the operation before you sign. We can check the taxes, the document, the risk, the purchase structure, and the main point that should be clarified before you transfer the money. Because our goal is not just to help you buy, our goal is to help you buy safely. And remember, before looking only at the balcony, at the swimming pool, or the ocean view, review the documents, because those documents may be what save you from a very expensive mistake.